We are going to hear the other side of the argument from Dr. Shah, and I give you 15 minutes to speak on it, and then I shall do the same sort of interrogation. Thank you.
So first of all, I should say that, yes, of course, I'm a law academic, but over the last nearly 3 years, let's say 2.5 to 3 years, I've become a sort of embedded academic. You know, you have these embedded journalists who go to Afghanistan and report about their, experiences of the war and so on, the bombings that they're trying to, dodge the Scud missiles and so on. So I've become a kind of embedded academic, right? Been trying to figure out what has been going on over these last just under 3 years with respect to the caste legislation. Obviously, given the story that our chair recounted, I came onto the situation quite late in the day, right? Because you mentioned that already since 2005 there were stirrings of this issue. It was dismissed, but then suddenly in 2010, in the Equality Act of 2010, we have a clause on caste discrimination. But I only came onto the scene when that clause was made into a mandatory clause, right? In other words, in 2013, there was an amendment passed to the Equality Act which made the caste discrimination clause, which obliged the government to implement the caste discrimination clause. If you look at the 2010 version, you'll see that the clause was basically giving a power to the government to implement it. In 2013, the government has an obligation to implement it, right? So now it's a question, not a question of if, but when, yeah, if you look at the statutory obligation. Now, obviously, this was a kind of ratcheting up of the campaign, right, for legislating on caste discrimination. In 2010, I mean, you mentioned helpfully that in 2005, there had already been a decision made that in the Single Equality Act, there would not be a clause on caste discrimination, right? In fact, certain assurances were, there are members present here who know that there were certain assurances given to the Hindu community leadership, right, organizations, that there would be no clause in the in the Equality Act, right? There would be no clause on caste discrimination. But at the 11th hour in 2010, you find that there's an amendment passed as introduced by Lord Harris in the House of Lords, which got accepted as part of the Equality Act, which adds or seeks to add caste as an aspect of race, right? Now that's quite important, that caste becomes an aspect of race, which means it's a face off, right? It's, if you look at the several faces of race, there is nationality, national origins, color, and so on, right? So caste becomes an aspect of that, right? So in other words, if somebody is being discriminating on grounds of caste, in effect, they're being accused of racial discrimination, right? So that you've got to bear that in mind. Now, I say that I came into this situation as an embedded academic. Well, the story is a long one, but I'll try to cut it short. One of the things that I realized immediately was that our Indian community organizations were finding it quite difficult to articulate a coherent response to this legislation, right? And if you go way back into the records, even earlier than 2010, you'll find that there is a kind of similar problem, right? So what exactly is being suggested by this legislation? Yeah, is there an imputation that our communities basically systematically discriminate on grounds of caste? And certainly that is actually an imputation, right? But that imputation is actually very hard to contest, right? It's basically the judgment has already been made that your community is systematically and immorally discriminate on grounds of caste, and all we need to do is have legislation on it. How do you argue against that? Right? So that was a problem, and I could sympathize with our Indian community organizations. How do you confront a problem like that, right? To add to that problem, you found that there is already an asymmetrical situation. But once you look at the research efforts, right? So I think the NISA report was mentioned by my colleague here. The National Institute of Economic and Social Research did a piece of research to try to establish the extent of caste discrimination in the UK. In fact, although we were given kind of a view that it endorses the need for legislation, the report is actually quite ambiguous. And if you look at the parliamentary debates, both from, especially from 2013, you'll find that the report is dealt with quite ambiguously. Some people saying, oh, it conclusively proves the need for or the case for legislation, whereas other people like Lord Dolokia said that actually the report does not no such thing, right? It actually leaves us in a kind of state of ambiguity. If you read the report itself, it says that we can't really tell you how wide caste discrimination is in the UK. Well, in order to do that, we need an entire research program. Right? So there is certainly an ambiguity in the way in which the report was written, right? And I don't think the writers of the report themselves were convinced about the existence of caste discrimination. Nevertheless, in 2014, you had two reports from the Equality and Human Rights Commission. Now, I'll say something by way of preface to that. The Equality and Human Rights Commission is an interesting body. It's a kind of quasi-governmental organization, as you might know, yeah? Now, the EHRC's functionaries had already declared back in 2010, before there was any research, that they backed the legislation. Right? That means our leading national equalities body is saying, without the need for any proof, that legislation is necessary. How did they get that idea? Right? If you look at the 2010 debates, again, you see Lord Lester, right? Famous equalities lawyer, right? The man behind the 1960s race relations legislation, which became the 1976 race relations legislation, and so on. He says, I don't see why any research is required, right? So again, right, when the requirement for research, which led to the NISA report, was pleaded, right, for the clause not to be brought immediately into effect, that was Lord Leicester's reaction, right? So in his mind, there was a kind of open and shut case. Of course, the Indian communities in this country discriminate on grounds of caste. So you have a succession of assumptions being made about what this community does. And so when you look at the research which was produced in 2014 by the EHRC, all the academics on that research team had already declared their position in favor of the legislation, right, before they did their investigation. Right? Now, their remit was basically to say, should this legislation be implemented, and if so, how should it be implemented? One thing they did was to advocate the widest possible scope for the legislation. Right? They'd already bought into the idea of the need for the legislation, but they wanted the widest possible scope. If you look at the protective ground of religion, which also exists in the Equality Act, you'll find that it's hedged around with exemptions and exceptions, and religious communities can do all kinds of things, right, without being subject or accused of being of violating the Equality Act. Not so with caste, right? Our Equality and Human Rights Commission research team says no, because it's equivalent to a form of racial discrimination. There should be minimalistic exemptions or exceptions made, right, for this. Now, actually, if you look at the EHRC reports quite closely, it doesn't deal with any of the potential downsides of the legislation, right? It's so enamored with the idea of this legislation, right, that it's simply just it's an exercise in endorsement, right? It's a fait accompli, if you like, right? That we have something in place. Our job is basically to endorse it, right? To approve it, and that so that legislators can go ahead, the minister can go ahead and make an order in parliament to implement it. That's it, right? So, for example, when I say downsides, what kind of downsides can we think about? A few months ago, after the 2013 amendment, if you listen to BBC Asian Network, you know the, what's the name of the DJ? DJ Nihal, right? Thanks. He has a program on Navratri, right? And continuously there's an allegation that your Navratri functions are violative of the Equality Act, right? Because all of you discriminate on grounds of caste, don't you? Every time you have a Navratri event, it means it's for this jati group or that jati group or that jati group, right? That means you don't admit people of other jatis, so that means basically you're violating the Equality Act, right? Now, if the Equality Act is brought in force, of course, those kinds of events will be subject, or the organizers of those kinds of events will be open to litigation, right? Claims for damages. Let's say there is a successful claim for damage. You only need one, right? Next thing you know, your organization is closed down, or at least it loses its charity status, because the next thing you know, it becomes subject to a charity commission investigation, right? Your tax exemption status goes. Right? Which means a core part of your funding, the basis for your funding goes, right? Next thing you know, slowly there is a kind of crumbling of the core social organization framework of the Indian communities in the UK. Yeah, the associational freedoms of the Indian communities in the UK starts to crumble, right? That kind of situation is not anticipated by the EHRC commission reports at all, right? Why not, right? Let's say, I don't have any children, but if I had a daughter, right, and I wanted to get her married, employ a Brahmin Pandit, right, for the ceremony. Now, some busybody can come along and say, well, I'm requiring services to be made available to me on caste grounds because I said I need to have a Pandit who is a Brahmin, right? I may not have even said that, he just happens to be Brahmin, but on grounds of the fact that so many of us basically employ Brahmin Pandits for the conduct of marriage ceremonies, basically we're discriminating on grounds of caste, right? Another core attack on one of our core associational freedoms, right? Our core practices within our traditions, right? That kind of idea is not entertained at all by the EHRC Commission, the Equality and Human Rights Commission reports. Why not, right? I mean, those are very easily anticipated, aren't they, right? Those kinds of potential downsides. What are going to be the exemptions for that kind of thing? So you see continuously an exercise simply to endorse the legislature. On the one hand, people say we don't need any research. When there is research, it assumes that the legislation is there for the right reasons, right? Refuses to look at the downsides and basically endorses a wholesale massive attack on our associational freedoms, right? And on our traditions, right? Now, how do you justify that? Now, one of the things, and it's interesting that Satpalji says that caste is basically a kind of hierarchical system. Right? Now, I want to interrogate this idea of a system. Right? Many people, even in the parliamentary debates, you can see this. Right? Many people, sometimes they say caste, sometimes they say caste system. Actually, the dominant way of looking at it is that even if you just say caste, it imports the idea of the caste system. Right? It imports the idea that whenever I say caste, it's a part of this larger system. Right? Now, this larger system is not just hierarchical. Right? It's also fundamentally immoral. That is also an imported meaning, right, into the invocation of the idea of the caste system. So the caste system is not a neutral entity, right? Whenever somebody speaks about the caste system, it's a fundamentally immoral institution. That's the message that we're supposed to receive, right? And that's why people like Lord Lester can say, well, I don't see why any research is needed, because it's obvious that the Indians bring with them a kind of immoral institution into the UK when they migrate here, right? Now, where did this idea come from? Now, in my research, I've got my book there. In my research, which led up to my book, I discovered that actually the idea of a caste system as a hierarchically ordered system, right, form of social organization, is Protestant in origin. Right? So you look at the multiplicity of different types of travelers who visited India for centuries on end: Chinese, the Greeks, Catholics, Muslims. None of these people problematized the idea of the caste system. Yeah? They saw Indian society, they studied it. The Muslims wrote volumes and volumes, yeah, about the nature of Indian society. They sent their reports back to Baghdad and all these kind of centers of Muslim learning, right? None of them mentions a caste system. Yes, they saw Indians practicing a form of false religion. Of course, Indians practice a form of false. Hindus are practitioners of a false religion. It accords with Islamic theology. Fine, right? They see the Pandits or the Brahmins as imams. Fine, right? Because they don't understand anything different. The Catholic, same thing. They see the Pandits as priests of a false religion, analogously to their own priesthood, right? But their own priesthood practices a form of true religion, and the Indians practice a form of false religion. No problem. But they never problematized caste. In fact, they saw caste as a civil institution, right? And therefore, they did not give any kind of moral connotation to the idea of caste. Yeah? If anything, they thought that caste was a saving grace of Indian society and culture, right? Why? Saving against whom? Saving against the power of the Brahmin priests, right? So they saw it as a positive aspect of Indian society. It's when the Protestants start writing, sometime in the late 18th century, that you see this imputation of immorality. Why? Because they bring together this form of social organization that Indians have, and the priesthood, and the religion that Indians practice, i.e. Hinduism, right? And Hinduism is, of course, a form of false religion. If it's false, it's fundamentally immoral. If it's fundamentally immoral, the kind of social practices, the kind of social organization which is endorsed by that religion is also immoral. It's fundamentally immoral. That's why today we have the image of a hierarchically ordered, fundamentally immoral caste system. It is a Protestant idea, right? Indians for centuries and centuries have had jati organizations, they believe in Varna, etc., etc. They never believed them to be immoral institutions. Right? Today, that's what we're expected to believe, that fundamentally you guys are immoral, right? Why should we believe that? Yeah, where is this sort of stigma and guilt coming? It's coming from... Yep, sure, yeah. It's coming from an external source, which is based on fundamentally different premises and ideas of human beings, the morality, social organization, religion, etc., etc. So it's certainly not indigenous to Indians. So whenever somebody suggests to you... Now, today you can say, you know, like Satpalji is saying, oh, we are a secular organization. We live under a secular form of law. But the fact is that these originally theologically Protestant ideas have seeped into, via Orientalism, into the social sciences, into the contemporary political ideas and political debates, such as you saw in 2010 and 2013, in a secular context, in a secular parliamentary context. But what do they do? They import basically theologically Protestant ideas into an analysis of Indian culture and society. And that's exactly what's happening today, right? So in a sense, they look secular, but it's actually quite theological. And it carries the stigma about our forms of social organization, right? And so that's the basic problem that you have with the idea of the caste system. So any such legislation is going to have dysfunctional effects, right? Not only that, it also, the idea of the caste system also supplies us with a ready means, an illegitimate one, but albeit a ready means to say, somebody somewhere did not accept change from a customer in a shop somewhere in the United Kingdom. That means that's caste discrimination. How do we know that? Did somebody get the story from the cashier's side? Satpalji, did you do that? Right? So where are these stories coming from? And according to what register are we interpreting them? Some kind of secularized version of Protestantism, or something which is faithful to the Indian traditions? Right? Thanks a lot. Okay. Thank you.
First part, you talked about the conflation of caste as interpreted into a racial discourse or a racialized version of discrimination. And tell us exactly what the repercussions of that are in the context of the definition of caste itself. Because, as I've said before, the Indian government's definition of caste is very specific. The British government has not yet established a caste definition. Therefore, if we are going to first talk about it as a racial discrimination, but do we need to understand what the caste definition is, or is that irrelevant?
Yes, can I go ahead and answer? Yes, of course you're right to say that the legislation avoids identifying what caste is, actually. It avoids defining what caste is. So what we get, the judges are going to have to import these common sense assumptions. I say they're common sense because they've now spread quite widely as common sense ideas about Indian culture and society, including in India, actually. In India, if you see the debate on caste, it's nonsensical, right? Now, but you are completely right to point out that in the Indian law, judges don't have to define what caste is because it's provided in a list. If I can say, oh, I belong to that list of people, then I have access to some preferential quotas, reservations, right? Now, our UK legislation not only does not define caste, but it leaves open the possibility of a set of open-ended claims of litigation, right? Anytime, tomorrow, the day after, next week, whatever, I can be laid open to a charge of caste discrimination.
So we do not need to distinguish which caste is discriminating against another caste. That definition doesn't have to come into it. Or will that have to be part of it?
Well, I think because nobody could define it, the legislators didn't know what it was, right? The people who wrote the reports for the NGOs, the EHRC, they didn't know what it was, right?
So would you say that this was one of the downsides of this legislation that you were mentioning as well?
If you look at the EHRC report, it says we should approach caste, the definition of caste, in an elastic way. Now, you're creating a lot of problems, right? And expecting the judges to solve these problems. Now, if you look at one of the test cases that went through recently through the courts in the High Court and then later on through the Employment Tribunal, the judge in that case at the Employment Appeal Tribunal level quotes one of the writers of the EHRC reports, right? Who is an expert, if you like, on caste issues. And she's quoted as saying, she's my opponent, of course, because she's on the other side. She's quoted as saying that there is no accepted sociological or anthropological definition of caste.
Right. And so for a judge in that context, for example, because I'm trying to get my head around this, it's a hierarchical system of discrimination, and discrimination is usually by someone with power against someone with lesser power, right? If a Brahmin is discriminating against a Kshatriya, there is an understood relationship between the two within this system as the common sense understanding. If it was the other way around, are we still able to bring caste discrimination legislation accusations against someone?
Yeah. Theoretically, you can.
Theoretically.
So, of course, the legislation imports an assumption because of these common sense ideas that Brahmins are the people who discriminate, or the upper castes are the people who discriminate. In Satpalji's words, the orthodox people are the people who discriminate, right? Now, but theoretically, now if you listen to the Ambedkarites, right, and their hatred for Brahmins, particularly in India, but it's coming in the UK now as well. One could easily start to sue these people as well. One could start a set of legal claims, because if you look at the level of Brahmin hatred in these Ambedkarite organizations.
So the definition of caste is actually quite vital in order to be able to be equitably fair and open, or do you think it's completely irrelevant?
The problem is nobody will be able to define it for you.
Okay, all right. Let's move on to the second part of your speech, where you discussed the research and the position of researchers before they'd even done the research. Now, here I have to really ask for some very careful thought and analysis, because what you are suggesting is that this independent body of researchers have a prejudged bias, and that's what they presented. That's quite an accusation to make, okay, because government is going to take that research and therefore use it, and has passed the amendment, etc. So it's very, very important that we're very clear about this. Are you suggesting, as Moomin has suggested, that the Hindu organizations feel that the parliament has actually been misled by these researchers who have already suggested what their position was before they'd done the research?
I can't speak for all the Hindu organizations, but I can certainly say that from my research, and I know some of these people personally, the researchers who worked on the EHRC reports and so on, their positions are already in published documents, right? Like, for example, David Keane, he was one of the EHRC report writers. He has a book in 2007, Caste Discrimination in International Law. Check it out, right? He completely endorses the Orientalist or Protestant account of the caste system, right? Which was later on absorbed by people like Ambedkar and so on, right? There's very little space between Ambedkar's account of the caste system and the Protestant account of the caste system, to be honest with you, right?
So this brings me now to my third question, which is exactly this idea, and Dr. Moomin, Mr. Moomin has already advocated that, you know, Hindus sort of dismiss the whole thing by suggesting that it's an interpretation, it's an imperious plot, and you are suggesting it's a Protestant interpretation of the system. Is that right? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, I mean, our current common sense ideas of the caste system have come down to us as a result of Protestant theological reflections on Indian culture and society.
So you're attributing this whole interpretation of caste discrimination as a Orientalism and sort of negating it from that perspective.
It is. The interesting thing is, though, that it still has purchase, right? Because these ideas are so deep-seated in the culture, plus the evangelists have begun to revive these ideas, right? So the evangelists have this mission of proselytizing and converting people in other parts of the world, right? Somehow they leave Europe to rot because, the church attendance and all that is kind of declining in Europe quite rapidly. So Asia is now seen as the ground of proselytization, and India has been identified as one of the core grounds, right? And so this links in quite nicely with the claim of Dalits or the so-called low-caste people to fight for reservations if they're Christian, right? At the moment, if you look at the Indian law closely, Christians and Muslims are excluded from the central government listing of those jatis or the caste groups which are entitled to reservations. Now, that is a big block on proselytization in India, right? So the real end game of the UK legislation is in India. The UK is simply being used as a proxy.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there because I also, in 2005, when I did my research, did realize very quickly that there is some sort of connection with the evangelical movement, proselytization, and the establishment of caste discrimination as a practice. However, and this is my last sort of thing I want to ask you, is I also was very, very aware that there is a demonization or there is a subjugation of a raft of people who are named by the English language as untouchables. Gandhiji called them by a different name. Now, if we were to have that form of systematic exclusion in this country, I would certainly oppose it. And then would we need this kind of legislation? Despite the fact that you dispute the evidence that Mr. Newman suggests that there is, and the HRC reports suggest that there is, if there is such evidence, do you advocate for caste discrimination as an important legislation piece, or would you suggest that it must be treated as a separate category altogether where it's clearly understood rather than a racial one?
No, either way you're going to have problems because we lack an adequate conceptualization of what caste is, right? Apart from this Orientalist idea of the caste system, we have no idea what caste is, right? Even Indian social scientists have consistently failed to define, let's say, jati you talked about, or varna, right? We don't know what these things really are, right? Social scientists certainly have no clue about them, right? So in that context, how are you going to expect lawyers and judges to decide what these things are? They can't do it, right?
So you think that it's a dangerous thing to have at all?
Yeah, absolutely.
And how would we protect, say, the clients or the people that Mr. Moomin represents? How would we, in this country, protect against discrimination of, and I don't mean the pubs or the temples, because I certainly do not agree under any circumstances that those are evidence. But I am going to respect Mr. Moomin as somebody who has actually categorical, real, substantive cases in the UK, where discrimination has occurred in a public arena. Now remember, discrimination isn't my neighbor calling me names, okay? So if somebody calls me a chamar, I cannot take that person to court. It is discrimination within public office, within employment law, etc. And it is those cases that we are talking about, and I'm suggesting and respecting that Mr. Moomin, through this event, is going to actually produce those kind of cases for us to talk about. If those cases do exist, what kind of legislation do we need to protect those people? Is the Single Equalities Act already sufficient, or do we need a caste category? I'm going to leave it at that and thank Dr. Shah very much for his presentation.